Hello, fictional. Welcome to the Fiction Series X. Today we are gonna see, what if Issei meets with the Kendo girls? Part 10. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Week 1, sit down Ice. Sona pointed to the spot across from her. The blanket set before them didn't help to alleviate the feeling of the hard ground just underneath. Taking up most of the space were several large books and a chessboard all set up. They'd been out here for several days now, living in the familiar forest just a few hundred feet from the mouth of Tiamat's cave. She was here because Issei needed to continue to learn how to think strategically, to predict what your opponent would do and find a way to counter it. The sun had gone down over an hour ago, Sona being held up because she'd been summoned to meet with Lord Beelzebub. Before taking him to Tiamat, they had gone to the lab where the evil pieces were created and Ajuka had scanned Issei. The results had taken some time because the Devil King wanted to examine all the results thoroughly. What she was told gave her a new appreciation for the very thing that enabled devils to increase their numbers. The evil piece placed into a person had the ability to mutate, she knew that already. What she didn't know was that under the right conditions, that mutation came with an evolution of sorts. Not even the creator could determine what it might be. The only thing they knew was that Issei was on the edge of mutating one of his 8 pawns. That was the theory behind Issei being able to bring out that family trait when he was with Reya's, but that couldn't be confirmed unless it was observed. This had raised a question that Sona needed to be answered. Would that mean that only someone with a mutation pawn would be able to trade for Issei? Surziches and Ajuka looked at each other knowingly, the Crimson Satan being there had merely by chance. Supposedly, the only limitation to a trade is that it must be a pawn for a pawn. There is nothing in the system that denies a trade other than that. It was obvious why such trades were never heard of. Why would someone trade their own mutation piece for a regular one? The loss of such potential was not something a devil would just readily accept. Sona would only be trading her pawn for a short time, but it would probably be the only trade of its kind since the creation of evil pieces. The subject of said trade was pacing around the blanket, something that was starting to get on her nerves. Ice. She called out to him once more, a little more force in her voice this time. He stopped just to the right of her before sighing. Coming to the spot she had pointed at, Issei plopped down and rubbed at the back of his neck. Sorry Kaichu. I know it's stupid, but I can't help feeling nervous with me being away for so long. He'd been antsy enough when she took him to Tannen for a week. Now he was spending almost an entire month away, which was only made worse because of that disaster of a stray hunt. It's okay. You were there when katase and murayama were given the contract slips and when we placed the ward on your home. They're safe, I promise you. It was the strongest one that they could muster. Herself, Tsubaki, Reya and Momo had taken nearly an hour of preparation just to make sure the strength and scope of what it would detect was sufficient. Shall we begin? Pushing her glasses into place, Sona flipped open one of the books and slid it to be facing her pawn. When Issei nodded, they began what was becoming their nightly ritual. While playing a game of chess, Sona would ask him questions covering several topics. They could range from tactics to naming the pillars or historical events of the underworld. Her goal was a simple one, really. Multitasking was an essential skill for a good king. Issei needed to be able to think and act at the same time. The first attempt at this had been a horrendous failure, but like most other things Issei was adapting quickly. What is the term for the fallen angel organization? Sona made the first move on the board. Tonight, Sona was going to change things up a bit, jumping to a variety of topics rather than picking a single one. The Grigori. His answer came quickly, moving a pawn on the board just as she had. Sona had noticed something in his style of play. Issei preferred to use the pawns rather than risk other pieces. He seemed to relate the game to her peerage and protected the bishops above all others except for the king. The only other piece he frequently used was the rook. She wasn't sure if this was even a conscious thought for him, it did however, give Sona a look into what Issei thought of her servants. It shouldn't have been too much of a surprise, since he and Yura had seemed to work extraordinarily well together. The blue-haired rook was the easygoing type and had taken to his orders when they were fighting together with no issue. The knight was used with caution, the bishops only when absolutely needed. What Sona took note of and reminded herself to fix in the very near future was how he only used the queen as a last resort. The game continued in its usual way. Sona decided on a strategy to use and watched how Issei countered all the while quizzing him. Things took a turn that surprised her when one of his pawns made it to the other side of the board. Aside from House Baal, what are the highest-ranking pillar families? That had been her question, as Issei moved the pawn. Balaam, Belial, Belith, Vine, Payman, Person, and Zagan. Promote to queen. Issei answered without needing more than a few seconds. When Sona looked back at the board, she wondered where Issei would move next. His choices were aggressive and belonged to no strategy she could name. 3 pawns sat in front of all the other pieces. Each of his rooks positioned at the outer edge acting as a sort of wall or watchtower. The knights were next, in a spot where they could swing out on either side of a pawn, and the bishops deeper in his defense, but still able to maneuver out if he needed them. Sitting in the back were the king and queen, untouched by this point in the game. She'd taken the other 3 pawns as she set herself up for a more defensive play. This one promoted pawn was a wild card that had her mind racing through everything she knew of the game. That was why Sona loved this game. No other game she'd played had the same potential for the unexpected. Countless strategies had been crafted over the years, many with apparent holes that could be exploited, some that could be deployed mid-game with only a few pieces necessary. Whatever Issei was doing had been intended from the start, and the longer she pondered on what his strategy was, the more excited she became. He was pushing forward yet holding back. Sona was tempted to go on the offensive just to see what he was planning. The knight on her right side moved to where it would be in the range of his pawn. To her surprise, it wasn't one of the pieces close by that he moved. Instead, it was his newly promoted pawn, seating itself in a spot that was able to take her knight no matter what she did. His piece was vulnerable where he put it, but judging from his playstyle, that was a calculated and accepted risk. The smile on her face was a poor representation of what she was feeling. Sona was seeing the proof of how her choice had been the right one. She knew that marriage and having children was something she couldn't escape from, but Sona wasn't opposed to that. Her problem was with the possible suitors and their view of the underworld. Too many of the men that her parents would most likely arrange for her would be happy with the status quo. They had lived in luxury all of their life, using the system and behind-the-scenes bribes to gain what they wanted, but would never strike out and do something different. Why would they? There was no immediate personal gain from something like that. This was a big part of the reason Sona made the agreement for a chess match to determine her husband. Someone who was able to beat her would have to think outside the box, see other angles, picture the future in ways that many didn't. By using a strategy that Sona had never seen before, Issei was proving himself to able of doing just that. The two of them were fire and water, polar opposites in so many ways. But they were symbiotic too, acting apart and together at the same time. Issei was going to be the source of a great deal of change in the underworld, the fire that burned away the old and rotting. She would be the water that nurtured new life, feeding that seeds that would sprout into something new, something better than what had been there before. Issei started to succumb to the exhaustion brought about by his training with Tiamat, and Sona won their game. When they retired to the tent Issei called home until the start of the new semester, Sona didn't feel the same nervous embarrassment that had come over her before. Issei needed to be healed every single night, and only the king would be welcome near the home of the strongest dragon king. Issei was asleep before Sona could remind him to face away from her, laying on his back and sprawled out over the mattress she summoned for them. With only a set of underwear covering her body, Sona felt the chill of the night air enveloping her. Waking him after the way he exerted himself recently was a hard task, something that she'd learned since the summer break began. Sona shivered as a stronger breeze came in through the cracks of their makeshift abode. She was perfectly capable of using magic to keep the temperature at a more reasonable level, but that would leave her more drained than the healing she was already required to do. Full body contact was the advised way to conduct this particular method, but Sona just wasn't comfortable with it yet. The loss that came from wearing underwear during this procedure was minimal though. As long as she mended him with regular magic when she appeared, Issei was at full capacity by morning as things were. Sona sighed as she saw that Issei hadn't bothered to get under the blanket, instead just laying on top of it. She was probably going to have a hard time sleeping now, since she was not someone who could sleep when anything less than warm. There wasn't much that she had to do tomorrow, so if she took a nap during the day it wouldn't be the end of the world. Humming to the side of the bed, Sona slowly crawled close to Issei, preparing herself for a long sleepless night alone with her thoughts. If he were awake right now, Sona had no doubt that she would be incredibly embarrassed. One of her arms was underneath him, the other lying across his chest, with her legs tangled into his. This was an incredibly intimate-looking position to be in. He might have beaten me had he not been so tired. Already Sona was losing herself in thought as her body soaked up the heat he radiated. Her fingers traced along his chest, feeling the proof of how hard he was working. Issei wasn't some overly muscled gym rat, he didn't have the build for it. He was much like many male pure-blooded devils that way, only a few families having the stature and genetic disposition for the muscle mass of anything resembling a human bodybuilder. Sona doubted that he went without a shirt for very long each day, probably only to bath in the spring nearby. But his skin held a tan easily, and he was just a shade darker than he had been when he left. The only thing she noticed was that it made his almost golden eyes more pronounced. Underneath that bronzing skin was the lean muscle that was far stronger than anything a human double his size could produce. His base strength had certainly gone up, a fact made clear by how sore he claimed to be. Supernatural beings had regenerative properties that usually made muscle aches non-existent. The only times it happened were when they were pushed well beyond the limits they had. Wondering if his speed had been just as affected as his physical power, Sona squeezed her legs around his. She paused when Issei shifted and she felt the tight muscle in his legs move with him. He thinks more about brute strength than anything else, or at least that's what happened before. She doubted Tiamat was purely focusing on how hard he could punch, but perhaps focusing a little more on speed wouldn't hurt. Her back and shoulders quivered as a stronger breeze came through. The paradoxical feeling was strange. The front of her body was content from the heat Issei produced, but her back felt like it had been exposed to winter winds. Issei shifted again, and this time Sona couldn't help but blush. Issei had rolled towards her, his arms coming to wrap around her body. When his hands started to rub up and down her back, that cold feeling started to go away. Cold. Sona. He was still fast asleep, as she could tell by the dead weight of the rest of his body. He had either felt the breeze and just acted on a subconscious instinct, or their connection gave it away. Either way, Sona was feeling that warmth take her away. Her limbs tightened around him and her head dipped to his chest, nuzzling her cheek against him to get more comfortable. Breathing in that slight smell of fire, feeling and hearing that thump of a heartbeat, lulled her to sleep quickly. It would be the first time since this began that she didn't wake with a headache or feel the need to down more caffeine than she would normally have in a week. The nights in that tent would give Sona a taste of something she knew was inevitable, but something she felt she wasn't quite ready for. Sleeping beside someone, getting accustomed to the way the bed shifted from the extra weight, the white noise of their breathing or light snoring, it was hard to go without it once it became a common occurrence. Diving down into the hazy water gave Issei a strange feeling every time he did it. The top was nice and cool, the bottom hot and bubbly. If he could maintain the depth and hold his breath for long enough, Issei would just stare right in the center. The sun was peeking over the horizon, which meant that it was time for his daily bathing attempt. Sore muscles and aches down to the center of your bones made it a little difficult to do after his training. His head sprung from the water as he gasped for air, looking to the ball of light in the sky. It was a facade, he was told, crafted by the Devil Kings to help the reincarnated devils get used to life in the underworld. Apparently, most devils resided down here and didn't bother living in the human world. He took another breath before diving back down. When he got to the point where the temperatures mixed, he yelled as loud as he could muster. Why did Reya have to show him the wonders of sexual release that didn't come from his own hand right before he was sent away from them? It was torture. Slow, methodical, nefarious torture. Having Sona pressed against him every night didn't help matters at all. The ever-increasing instincts that he held at bay were furious that he wasn't seeking any of the 4 girls outright at this very moment, throwing them to the ground and making sure that walking was an impossible task for the next day if not longer. Maybe she planned it to be that way. So that when he came home, the only thing on his mind would be her and the things they could do. He shook his head in the water, feeling the resistance of it. That was a stupid thought. Reya didn't know that he was going to be spending all his summer break down here. In fact, she was probably more frustrated than he was if her enthusiasm of sucking him off was any indication. As he appeared above the water once more, a light bulb went off in his head. He had 4 girls. Against all the odds, he had a harem. The moronic middle schooler still residing deep within started chuckling as he realized that he had achieved the very goal that he and his 2 friends had set out to do. They were going to be so jealous. Motohama and Matsuda had the benefit of getting into the same school, so they hadn't gone through the same realization that came from being apart. Which was, that girls don't want a guy whose goal is to be fucking multiple women, with that goal being the driving force of who he courted. Men, especially young men, were driven from hormone-produced desires. School, food, bathing, thought, all of it was put below the need to spread the seed as puberty took its course. It had taken quite a few lonely nights and several ice pack-filled days for him to fully understand this. Yui and Kaori had been unrelenting for the first few days after meeting them. The girls wanted someone to share with, spend time around, have fun, talk, someone that cared. And Issei did, it was just buried beneath all the dirty thoughts and fantasies that became his normal train of thought when he was around his old friends. After scrubbing himself down as best he could in the shallow parts of the spring, Issei stepped out onto the small patch of grass before the rocks became more prevalent. With it being so early still, neither Drake or Elsha was awake at the moment. He wasn't sure if they ever really slept, but they did go silent for hours at a time, so he assumed they did. Looking up into the sky, Issei sat down on the grassy area to enjoy his brief time in peace. Once the sun cleared the tallest tree, Tiamat usually woke up and would start pounding into him almost immediately. If this is what Elsha went through to become so strong, he had a new appreciation for her kindness. Issei could see this type of thing ruining someone's demeanor for a good long while. The leaf was crunched behind him, a sound so small that it went unnoticed. Elsha and Tiamat had a few conversations since he'd been here. It had only lessened hatred towards him enough that she wasn't snapping his arm every day just for the hell of it. The Dragon King was still skeptical of him, but that was okay. As long as he could help his girls, help his family stay safe, she didn't have to like him. It would help, but it wasn't necessary. She also hadn't told him anything of this treasure yet. Week 2. It feels like you're trying to kill me. Issei wheezed in between words as he laid on the ground. Once again Tiamat had shown him just how far down the totem pole he was. Every attempt he made at an attack was deflected or dodged, sometimes even just straight up reflected back to him. It wouldn't seem that way if you weren't so weak. She had never given him anything but the blunt truth. At first, Issei had been thankful for it, if a little agitated by the constant dismissal. But now it was starting to bring him down. It didn't feel like he was getting any stronger. The increased time in the spars only seemed to be from him getting used to her movements. "Get up," she demanded as Issei felt her presence wash over him once again. Slowly, Issei stood from the ground, almost falling when his arm buckled. When he turned to face Tiamat, her blue hair whipped out behind her as that same blue manifestation swirled around her body. The dragon's aura was a powerful thing. Issei had been told that on multiple occasions. But only when he saw the Chaos Karma dragon make it visible to him did he finally understand just how powerful it could be. Tiamat was a beauty that Issei thought would be hard-pressed for any supernatural being to match. That was overshadowed by the vicious way she approached training. There were no breaks between different exercises outside of getting into position. If she knocked him down on the last set of a physical spar, the moment he stood upright signaled the beginning of the next task. "Bring forth your aura, hatchling." That statement was followed by Issei throwing himself back to the ground in order to avoid the deadly blue wave that whipped towards him. When he wasn't so exhausted, Issei would have been able to at least try to deflect her attack. As he was right now, that would have only ended in pain. He could hear Tiamat give a sound of disappointment from the side as he got up and tried to follow her instruction. Issei tried to be an optimistic person, hoping for things to work out for the better. In this case, the jar was most definitely half empty. He had only been able to make that aura visible once, and only for a mere 5 seconds before he had been too drained to maintain it. It hadn't been anywhere near what Tiamat could do, only being a thin red lining around his body. Issei wondered if he'd be able to do better if he were fully rested. For whatever reason, Tiamat never started their day of training with anything but physical training. He tried asking once, but she just said that her reasoning didn't matter, only the results did. It was hard to argue that point since the strongest woman to wield the boosted gear had been trained by the same person. It was hard to describe the feeling brought on by trying to make his aura a tangible thing. His body was ajar, and the opening is hardly big enough for his hand to fit in. The texture was different from day to day. The time he actually managed to do it, it felt like he was grabbing snow, only it was the furthest thing from cold. Tiamat's didn't seem to have a temperature even though it had burned his clothes. Issei's did though, and there was nothing he could compare that heat to. To do what Tiamat wanted, he had to reach into that jar and grab onto his power. Issei wasn't sure where the problem was specifically. He had to grab it and pull it out. If he didn't squeeze it enough, the power would just fall through his fingers. But if he squeezed too hard, it was like he had tapped the same motion of his dragon shot, and his energy would come out in an explosive manner. Tiamat was probably still angry with him over the crater by her cave, from when his body basically exploded. The fingers of his metaphorical hand dipped into the jar, and he wondered what it would feel like today. It would have probably gone much smoother if Tiamat hadn't forbidden Elsha and Drake from helping him in any sort of way. But she had, and the two had been silent just about the entire time he'd been here. Issei could feel his instructor getting ready to send another blast his way when he finally touched his power. It was like putty, pliable to his will. The only limitation was his ability to mold it inside of the small space it resided and pull it out. The attack was launched at him, the blue fiery matter about the size of a volleyball. Issei wasn't confident enough to move and still maintain his focus, so instead, he had to hurry and hope that he succeeded in time. He didn't. Issei was sent flying back a few dozen feet, his red shirt sporting an ice hole burned through it. When his body met the ground, he rolled until a tree made him stop, coughing from the force and the dirt he'd accidentally inhaled along the way. Aside from the ringing in his ears, Issei thought he heard something sizzling. Propped up to his hands and knees, Issei opened his eyes and tried to figure out how far he'd just been launched. What the fuck? He was having a hard time making sense of what he saw. Everything was coated in red, the few and far between blades of grass being burned away, and the smaller grains of gravel melting into glass underneath him. Not realizing what was happening, Issei quickly stood up, nearly losing his balance as he did. The red was still coating much of his vision. When he turned to where Tiamat was standing, looking for something to tell him what was going on, he was met by the surprised look on her face. Her blue eyes were wide open, and her mouth slightly hung open. It was the first time he'd seen anything other than anger or indifference from her. She was staring at him, or rather the red aura billowing off of his body. Issei looked at his arms and saw that the red stuff was densely packed around his body, whipping off in tendrils like he'd seen with Tiamat's own. He was still pretty tired, but bringing forth that aura almost seemed to revitalize him in a way. Since he was thinking in terms of analogies, it was like trying to fill a cup that had a false bottom. He had gotten used to that fake peace being the limit of his stamina, of his cup being full. Whatever had just happened inside of him had taken out that false bottom and he was able to feel the full scope of what he could do. That look of surprise then turned into a bloodthirsty smirk. After 11 days, the hatchling finally shows some real progress. Judging from her tone and look, Issei was not going to like the amped-up training she was about to put him through. Her eyes darted to the line of bushes on the edge of the clearing quickly before settling back on Issei. Something was there, watching them carefully. Tiamat knew what it was but had no idea why it was here. As long as it stayed out of the line of fire and in the background, she had no problem with it. Issei still hadn't noticed the creature that had likely been watching him train for at least several days now. His senses were likely jammed up with her being so close by. Not that he was accustomed to using them like she was anyway. Why are you here, little one, and not at the mountain? Tiamat had accepted the task of training the devil host of Dreg. She was not about to let her curiosity get the better of her when the chance for her treasure to be returned was her reward. As Tiamat gave Issei instructions on how to best use his aura as a weapon, the creature in hiding stayed. Seeming to wait for the right chance to do whatever it was planning. It was cold here. Too cold. The only place she could find the warmth to sleep comfortably was by that steaming water she saw him in. It was where she met the half-kin and had been staying for a while now. She didn't know what to do. The half-kin was nice to her, but did not have the means to help her. Millie, she said she was called. Millie was not bothered by the cold and was claimed by the devils. There was always the chance that she'd leave one day and not come back. A weak cough escaped her mouth, the entirety of her small and weak body shaking and convulsing with each one. She was tired of being sick, she was tired of being tired, she was tired of being hungry. It was the only thing she'd felt in too long. Her large wings ached as they rested against her long and scrawny body. For a dragon, she was a disgrace, or at least that's what the others had always said. Even Mother said so, in the end. A dragon was meant to be big, powerful, fearsome. She was small and too weak to even fend for herself. A lifetime of illness had left her body deprived of the nutrients needed for growth. When she had gotten one of the others sick, her mother and the other adult dragons told her that she had to leave before all of them were infected with the strand of flu she had gotten as an infant. Her tail dipped deeper into the warm water of the spring as her mood lowered further. The dragon flu was a nasty thing and one of the only illnesses her race was affected by. But this strand of it had killed a few over the last couple of years and her immune system had never fully developed because of how young she was infected. The berries and fish she had managed to scrounge up would only be enough for so long. She needed help. She didn't want to die. She wanted to fly without getting winded so easily, to enjoy the things others her age were able to. But she couldn't. Even if she had the ability to leave the underworld, the humans would only hunt her like some sort of monster. Her search was getting frantic as the days went by and she could feel how much weaker her body was getting. When she saw him, the one with the brown hair, the one that was dragon yet devil, she hoped he would help. But then she saw him go to Tiamat and that hope was slowly dying just like her body. Tiamat didn't like dealing with the ones that she had previously lived with, but she didn't know why. Neither did Tannen now that she thought about it, but he at least still cared enough to come by every now and then. How did the brown-haired one look like a human? The winds that she should be able to manipulate easily had carried his scent to her from a distance. He was pretty strong, but from what she'd been told only the strongest were able to look human. She wanted to talk to him, to plead for help even if Tiamat was there, and tried to convince to stay away. He smelled like the fire that was always burning in the center of their village. Red, hotter than anything she'd ever experienced, but pleasant and welcoming at the same time. That dark scent of devilry hid behind it, but she didn't care. If I could just talk to him. But she hadn't been able to speak in over a week and any movement made her shake and get cold. How long had it been since what little fire she was able to breathe had snuffed out? A year, maybe even longer. If only I looked like him. Then she could go to the human world, bask in the sun and get warm, find food and stay away from the sickness that always seemed to find her. Her dark gold-scaled body started to go limp against the ground as the exhaustion started to catch up. It always scared her, the chance that she might not wake up the next morning. But luckily this area didn't have many predatory creatures, thanks to Tiamat living nearby. The idea of looking human was stuck in her head as the already dark surroundings got darker from her fading vision. And the harder she thought about it, the faster it dimmed. Even as she fell asleep, her lungs wheezed as they inhaled as deeply as they could, her body shook, and a light cough came after almost every single one. The chances for a lower-level wind dragon like her attaining a human form were nearly zero. But if there was a chance, she would take it. No matter what it might cost. The sun rose up over the horizon, painting the sky from its dark colors into an orange almost fiery glow. When Issei opened his eyes, he wasn't surprised to feel that Sona was already gone. She had started leaving before he woke up for some reason. That was fine, even though he wouldn't mind waking up and feeling her holding on to him. Oil and water. He had to remind himself. Kings and servants don't mix that way. It was getting harder and harder each time though. Setting his feet on the ground, Issei stretched and tried to wake up enough that he wouldn't just fall asleep while trying to wash up. His thoughts drifted back into an area he felt best avoided. Sona wasn't busty or curvy the way a lot of other girls were, but it didn't make her any less beautiful. Her violet eyes were an especially vibrant contrast with her deep black hair. He just wished that she would smile more. Even the small one she would sometimes show always managed to leave him stunned for several seconds afterward. Each time Issei had been able to do nothing but stare. Better get to it otherwise, Tiamat might just drag me to the spring and throw me in again. He shook his head and walked out. He was feeling pretty good today. The training had definitely picked up in its intensity, just like he thought it would, but since the day he managed to access his dragon aura, he'd been healing up better. Issei was at the halfway point in his training here, and Tiamat said that it was just about the time that he started using the boosted gear. He was looking forward to it and finally getting past whatever evolution stage he was apparently at. But the towel over his shoulder, Issei walked along the path to his bathing area. He was thinking about trying to take 2 a day because Sona had commented on how he smelled when they went to bed. She hadn't said he smelled bad, but that was what he figured she meant. It was probably true with how hard he was working during the day. Although now that he thought about it, he hadn't been sweating that much. Either Tiamat's fire aura was evaporating it or his own was. That didn't mean he was left stench-free though. Speaking of stench, something caught his nose as he walked. Issei turned his nose up to get a better whiff of it and instantly covered his nostrils. Rotten eggs and spoiled milk, maybe with a dash of feta cheese along with it. It didn't smell good and almost had him gagging from it. Hopefully, it wasn't close to the spring and the scent of the minerals in the water would keep it away. Issei decided to just breathe through his mouth until he got to the spring, thinking on how he might stack up against his fellow peerage members after this training. With the way that Tiamat had been favoring physical training most of the time, he figured that he'd be able to take on Yura and win. When the water came into view, Issei took a large breath through his nose. As soon as he did, the bushes nearby were unlucky enough to be chosen as his spot to void his stomach. The smell was much stronger here. It was like he had crammed the stuff right up his nostrils. Gonna have to snort some water or something to clear that out. Fuck that smells. He mumbled as he wiped at his chin. Once his stomach felt settled enough, he made the short walk into the clearing towards the water. Just as he was about to drop his towel and dive in, something caught his eye. On the far back right of the spring was a figure lying on the ground, one leg in the water. Not moving. Issei ran over, thinking the person to be injured or worse. Even if they weren't and had just fallen asleep, this was not the kind of place to do that. The howls, barks, and grunts he'd heard since coming down here made it obvious that something would take advantage of whoever was lying there. He wasn't about to let someone become an easy meal. Issei ran along the water's edge, his bare feet toughened from exposure over the last 2 weeks, crunching the grass and gravel beneath him. Shit. He could see that it was a girl, a small girl. The closer he got, the more worried he became that something unimaginable had happened to her. She was naked, turned on her stomach, and unconscious. "Hey miss." He called out as he got closer. Her sandy blonde, almost brown hair went down just below her shoulder blades, but didn't cover the fact that she had no underwear on. Issei slowed down to a fast walk, now only about 30 feet from the girl. From her size, she couldn't be older than 10. Thin legs and arms, her ribs showing against her skin, she looked extremely malnourished. He could even see the vertebrae in her spine along her back. Kneeling down, Issei looked her over really quick. She was alive at least. Shivering, wheezing, naked and alone in a place that had monsters of a wide variety, but alive. A series of coughs came through her mouth, and Issei leaned back as her head turned to cough in his direction. She sounded like shit. What made him worry more was the way her entire body convulsed when she coughed. It looked and sounded painful, with her legs and arms clenching like that. "Miss," he called out, slowly reaching to touch her on the shoulder. When his hand touched her skin, his eyes widened from how cold she felt. It was icy almost. He didn't know what to think, but the girl seemed to welcome the heat he produced. Her head had turned towards him, and she gave a very quiet and content sound. Maybe he could warm her and wake her up at once. With a hand on each of the girl's shoulders, Issei started to rub hard, hoping that the friction would at least quell the cold she was feeling. The shivering started to go away. "Miss, wake up." Issei pulled his hands away, figuring that he'd done enough to try and wake her. But still, she just slept. Her lips pulled down and brows furrowed as another coughing fit came. This one sounded wet, and as the last few came out, the girl heaved in as much air in between as she seemed able. Issei went to try and wake her again when she turned over and started shivering once more. He ignored the fact that he was right in front of a naked girl. For one, she was incredibly young, and looking at her with anything other than concern at the moment was just wrong. Issei did not have a thing for kids. His heart ached when he saw her abdomen. It was sunken in, and her ribs were the only thing giving her a slightly average form. It looked like she hadn't had enough to eat in months. What was strange though, was how clean she looked. For someone so malnourished, she was clean and her skin smooth and unblemished. So at least he ruled out physical abuse. But why was she out here? Miss, you have to wake up. Issei tried being louder this time. The only response he got was her eyes fluttering like she was in an unpleasant dream. Something came from her lips, but he hadn't been able to hear it. Words didn't seem to be working, so Issei went back to warming her up and hoping that her eyes would open. Issei suddenly felt like an idiot. Here he was, trying to warm someone up with his hands when he was literally a dragon. At least partially. Looking around, he saw that there were enough small dry pieces of wood and leaves that he'd be able to start a fire that could keep her warm. Quickly gathering what he thought would be enough and his towel to cover the girl up, Issei got to work. Only a small breath of flame was needed to get the pieces to light. Once that was done, Issei sat by her side and wondered where to go from here. Small hands clutched at the large towel, holding it against her as tightly as he imagined she was capable. The girl's face had sharp features, even for a girl as young as he thought she was. Her skin was a shade that couldn't be healthy, but then again, he only knew so much about devils or other supernatural beings. The minutes ticked by as Issei wondered what to do. Should he call Sona? Should he bring the girl to Tiamat? That smell from earlier seemed to be coming from her, so maybe she was sick. But why was she out here alone? Even though the fire crackled not more than 5 feet away from her, the girl shivered uncontrollably. Issei was still unsure of what to do. If she was a devil, who did he bring her to? Surely Sona would know. But Tiamat assumed a human form, so maybe she lived in the familiar forest. If so, then Tiamat would be the best choice. He felt no power from her, and the only thing he could smell was that apparent illness that had her cold and coughing. Issei stopped his wandering thoughts when he heard her speak again. It was quiet, almost beyond his enhanced range of hearing, but he was sure that she'd just said help. There was no way he was about to just leave her here. When her stomach growled and Issei could visibly see the way it rumbled the towel, he thought that bringing her to his tent would be the best bet for now. If he could get her to wake up, Issei would give her some food, talk to both Tiamat and Sona about where to go from here. Sona rubbed the bridge of her nose as she felt the magic circle transport her to the familiar forest. Mornings were beginning to get tiresome for her. It wasn't that she was having trouble sleeping, quite the opposite actually. Issei was a fantastic source of heat to keep her warm while she healed him. For some reason, she just wanted to lay there late into the morning, feeling that the day could wait even though she had things to do. Another reason was the return of Isla Beelit, the succubus student council president of Kuo Academy. The girl had gone on an extended leave of absence for a coming-of-age period that her species required. Unfortunately, whatever was supposed to be done during this period hadn't occurred yet. So Isla was irritable at best until she finished at least 3 times. The student council room had been soundproofed in case Sona needed to have sensitive conversations relating to the supernatural, but Isla was using that as a go-ahead to be as loud as she wanted while watching her visual prescription. Porn. The girl was watching porn and masturbating in the office. The months ahead were going to be tiresome until Isla graduated. Any cells in that brain of yours, oh great. Tiamat was yelling for some reason. The flash of blue died down, and Sona was met with a clearly irate Dragon King and a surprisingly confrontational Red Dragon Emperor. What was I supposed to do? She's just a little girl and clearly needs help. The two of them were standing by the tent, Issei crossing his arms, while Tiamat literally had smoke coming from her nose and mouth. That is no little girl, hatchling. That is a dragon that has an illness that kills the likes of you and I. From what you've said, and what I can smell, she is so ill that she's likely to die any day. Sona rose an eyebrow at hearing them. She took an inhale of breath but didn't catch anything unusual. Her pawn went rigid, but from what she wasn't sure. The only thing she could tell was that something in that statement didn't sit well with him. He looked sad for a moment before that turned to burning resolve. It has to be a sudden onset, so maybe if she gets some help she'll be okay. That smell wasn't around here yesterday. He turned towards the tent, and Sona felt his pieces vibrating strangely trough their connection. This world is going to chew you up and spit you out very quickly if you do not harden yourself to the harsh reality that some are dealt. Sona expected Issei to back down, thinking that Tiamat had beaten down her pawn enough times that he would concede to her will. She was wrong. While she suspected that this was a result of Tiamat's presence reinvigorating the dragon instincts her pawn was still developing, Sona saw this as a good thing. He didn't back down just because someone stronger or of a higher station said he should. He just needed to know when to follow that instinct and when to stay quiet. If she's a dragon, then why don't you want her to live? Haven't the numbers dwindled enough? I refuse to believe that someone as compassionate as Elsha would call you her friend if you were so heartless. Sona expected that there had been some change in the interactions between the two of them because the Dragon King didn't explode on him. You misunderstand my acceptance of the young one's situation, Issei. Although judging by the expression Issei had, this was likely the first time Tiamat had actually used his name. She has been lurking in this area for most of your time here. I had wondered what her intentions were, and now that has been answered. Your presence drew her here. It is likely she would have approached you before now, had I not been around. She is weak to the point of throwing her pride away, something that a dragon would only do when extremely desperate. Her transformation only makes the outcome clearer. Sona stepped from the place where she'd appeared, the light crunching of gravel beneath her shoes, alerting the two dragons of her being there. Her pawn's eyes widened, and a small look of hope came across his face. I see that once again, things have taken an unexpected turn for you Ice. He gave her a wry smile, while Tiamat merely rose a brow and crossed her arms. Sona's presence was probably not really wanted, but the Dragon King wasn't arguing it yet. Why would this dragon stalk my pawn rather than come to you Tiamat? Also, why does this transformation have any effect? Sona had read as much as she could find on dragons, but texts on the race were scarce and only helpful when dealing with the ones that had significant power. The heavenly dragons and dragon kings mostly. Everything else was generalized information that seemed to apply to most subspecies. This was an opportunity to learn, as well as solve a problem. The wind dragons hardly leave their mountain on the edge of Devil Lands. They are a prideful bunch, more than they really have any right to be. Wind dragons are a low tier, the strongest of which is only on par with the average high-class devil. Their only claim to fame is speed. Tiamat looked over to the tent, a brief sad look coming over her, almost quick enough for Sona to miss it. The little one is small for her age. She has likely been sick for most of her life. The strand of flu that we dragons can contract festers and gains in strength with weaker hosts. She forced herself into a human form, making her look like a child of no more than 10, draining almost all of her power from her body. The flu will take advantage of that. Sona went over that information, while Issei looked like he wanted to run into the tent and comfort the sick dragon. But why would she try to look human if it would only make her worse? Tiamat did not wither under his pained copper stare. All she did was make a gesture towards him with her eyes and head. Issei stepped back like the revelation was a physical blow. I did this. When Tiamat nodded, she also raised a hand to stop Issei from any further outbursts. Her clan worshipped Drake for his strength and even still has his flame heating their village. She may not have realized who she was seeking, but your aura feels quite similar to his, due to your turning. You are the reincarnation of the being that her family has praised for centuries. When she saw you in human form, my guess is that she tried to emulate it in order to approach you. Issei had his head lowered and his fists clenched to the point they were shaking. No, not another. Sona had heard about the development he'd gone through so far, but was not prepared for it to manifest itself right now. Boost. The red gauntlet appeared on his left hand. The call from the Welsh dragon echoed off the hills and trees, bouncing back to them like a faded reverb effect. Issei's hand clenched a little more and a sea of red erupted from his body. Sona had to cover her eyes from the light that his aura produced. While the pressure of it was astounding, it didn't affect her like Tiamat's had. Instead of a sense of impending doom, Sona felt like that red energy was more comforting than anything. Like feeling a soft current of warm water pass over and through her, it wanted nothing more than to bring peace to those who were in its hold. From her peripheral, Sona saw Tiamat narrowing her eyes in thought. Boost. The next call rang out sooner than expected, the green gem in the center of the gauntlet pulsing brightly. I won't let another die because of me. Issei's mind was racing, from the image of that woman dying because he wasn't quick enough, to what could happen if he kept being so hopeless when it mattered. The black talon slicing through the skin of a human that was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Boost. The strike to the head that had knocked out Tomo and left her vulnerable. Boost. Reya's limping steps when they were finally finished, something that had only happened because he had hesitated. Boost. The way Momo could hardly keep her eyes open as they walked away from the scene and towards the transport circle. While it may have seemed insignificant, the way Sona hadn't adjusted her glasses back into their proper place on the bridge of her nose spoke more of her exhaustion than words could. Then his mind took the route of the what-if scenario. What if it hadn't been his devil friends that had been caught in that fight? What if it had been Yui that had been the one to take that strike to the head? That had been able to knock Tomo off her feet? The chance that his pink-haired, sharp-tongued friend would walk away at all were small. And Kaori, if it had been her to take those wounds to her leg, what were the chances that she wouldn't have bled out on the ground? It made him angry. That was a B-class Dre, and he was supposed to be the wielder of something that had made the leaders of all three factions band together because of his might. The aura expanded, pulsing from its position around Issei to the encompassing area. He wasn't good enough. He had to be better. No, not better. He had to be the best. The last image to pass through his mind before the world exploded in red and green was that of his mother being impaled by those talons, the unmoving smirk of the stray so close to her face, contorted in unimaginable pain. Boost. What was all of this training and preparation for, if not to prevent things like that? Boost. His hesitation had already cost one life. Boost. What would it cost the next time? Boost. 5, 10, 50. Boost. His world grew quiet as something brewed beneath the surface. Issei couldn't see it, but Tiamat smirked as she felt the shift in the balance that held the world together. It was a universal law that was only able to be broken because one deity sought to even the playing field. To give the creatures he loved above all others a chance to fend for themselves. Sona felt like her body was being pulled towards that red ocean radiating off of her palm. The trees, the sky, even the dirt underneath her was tinged in the color represented by so many things. Desire, power, aggression, fire, blood, violence, excitement, passion, love, sincerity, happiness. Sona had seen most of these aspects represented by her pawn in spades, and the others fit well, if only because of the abilities he was working to master. A thought passed through Issei's mind. One that opened so many possibilities, but also brought just as much danger along with it. Sickness and death was part of the natural order of the world. It gave room for others to take the place of the one leaving this plane of existence, nourished the earth with the minerals of the body. Power was how the world worked, whether it be physical, political or financial. The weak bowed to the strong, followed them in the hopes that they could pick up the scraps. Hesitation leads to mistakes, mistakes lead to a shift in power. Power was how he would protect what was his. He was born as a human, a being so low on the totem pole that they were overlooked by the supernatural, as just a tool to further their own goals. Sona wouldn't come out and say it, but it had become clear to him. The order of the world, the balance, said that he should be insignificant in the grand scheme of things. His will should have no effect on events that took place. Fuck the order, fuck the balance. If balance says that I have to lose what's mine, I'll break it. Welsh Dragon Balance Breaker. Underneath that bright glow emanating from his body, Sona and Tiamat were able to see the red plates of armor appear on his chest and legs, extending outward from the center of each jeweled piece. Every new section seemed to slide out from underneath the last, covering the upper arms and legs, before moving up his abdomen and covering his shoulders. Issei lifted his head, and the two women saw his eyes shining the same emerald green of the gems of the armor. When the plating reached his chin, two small golden horns along his jawline, the helmet materialized out of thin air like the centerpieces had. The sound of something leathery reached them before two massive wings expanded themselves from his back. The membrane between the red spines being gray, a tail extending from between his shoulder blades and reaching the ground with a thud. I suppose Elsha was right. Tiamat broke the silence that had descended over them after the loud announcement of Issei reaching a new level of power. Sona wanted to speak, to ask what Tiamat meant, but her mind was too overloaded with everything else going on at the moment. Her pawn stood there clad in the armor of legend, radiating enough power that she thought would even give a few of the newer ultimate class devils a run for their money. Sona wanted to know what had gone on in his head that triggered this change. They had only been having a conversation about a sick dragon. One that had been apparently trying to confront him, when she. Violet eyes went wide when she realized it. The dragon had forced a change upon herself that was going to kill her, with how weak she already was. This human form was only something she wanted because Issei had a human form. He felt that it was his fault. That her condition was something he had personally caused. To Issei, it wasn't a poor choice made by the person affected. Instead, it was just another example of his failure. They're different from the other hosts. Issei turned to the tent as his new wings folded in. I won't just stand here and let her die. If power is what she needs to pull through, I'll give her mine. Looking down to his left hand, Issei called out to the dragon that had been quiet for most of his time in the underworld. Drake, you told me that sacred gears are powered from the user's will. Can I help her? Each of the gems pulsed as the dragon of domination responded to his host. You may not be able to cure her, but you can certainly make it easier for her body to fight it off. When Issei started walking towards the tent, Sona started to follow. Just before she pushed the opening aside, Sona heard a metallic clang on the floor as Issei dropped to his knees. I'm sorry Kaichu, I didn't mean to ignore you like that. Especially when you're only here because I called you. Issei apologized when he heard her enter. Sona caught sight of the girl they were talking about, her eyes giving an experienced once over. Her family had the most advanced hospital in the underworld and several renowned ones in the human world. Medical situations were nothing new to her. Even if this girl were awake, Sona doubted that she'd even be able to stand in her emaciated state. Don't apologize. You're doing a good thing, Ice. Although I hope that you don't get sick as well. Here. A magic circle spawned around on her hands, which Sona held in front of where his nose and mouth would be. Being this close to his armored form, Sona couldn't help but think of how intimidating it looked. Sharp lines along each of its edges, along with the large wings and tail, it was no wonder that the Red Dragon Emperors of old were so feared. If it wasn't the power they held, the look might have scared a few enemies off by itself. The place just in front of her hand now had an almost invisible current of air. She placed her hand on the ground next, and the same circle and effect came about inside the entire tent. This will help. The air is being pushed through a magical filter of sorts. It should kill any virus the girl is breathing out. The walls of the tent waved from the air current. Sona was better with disinfecting things through her water magic, but this was something that the hospitals under the Citri name used to help clean the rooms. The one placed on the tent itself wouldn't have been enough since Issei was in such close proximity to the sleeping girl. He could have gotten infected before her magic had the chance to clean the air. This isn't your fault. Sona tried to convince him as he gently placed his hands on the girl's chest and abdomen. Boost. The gems covering him shined for just a moment. Not entirely, but I should have noticed her earlier. I was so caught up in my training that I didn't notice a thing. Transfer. The two watched as the girl's body visibly relaxed, her eyes fluttering behind her eyelids. How long will that last for her drag? She's not exerting herself physically, so probably a few hours. I would only give her one at a time, partner. Wind dragons are not all that powerful, you could cause more harm by giving her too much. Drake's voice was surprisingly quiet and almost sounded sullen. Tiamat had implied that Drake had some sort of relationship with at least one wind dragon, but neither his host or Sona were inclined to ask about that right now. The red helmet faded from view as Issei turned to his right, facing his king with a pleading look. Aichu, if she doesn't wake up in the next couple days, can we get her to a hospital? True to her upbringing, Sona went over the pros and cons of helping this dragon quickly in her mind. There were only two things that Sona considered negatives about helping the girl. The first was that the girl likely didn't have the money to pay for treatment. The dragon was without aid from her family, and dragons were selfish in nature. They didn't distribute their wealth lightly. The second was how the girl would react when and if she ever woke up. If she awoke to find herself in an unfamiliar environment and didn't want to be there, she might attack anyone coming in to help. But she had sought Issei out in the first place. Perhaps a dragon's pride wouldn't be a factor for this particular one. And just maybe things would turn out in their favor. She might even want to be his familiar. If that were the case, Sona would certainly pay for whatever treatment might be required. This left her in a similar situation that she'd found herself in Issei. There was a high risk, but also a high reward. In terms of a familiar, a dragon of any type was rare and powerful. Was she willing to take those risks? I'll work off the bill somehow, please Kaichu, I need this. Maybe being around Issei was affecting her more than she previously thought, as she smiled warmly at him. How could she deny him anything when he asked her like that? Her nature as a devil was being stoked to an extent she'd never experienced before meeting Issei. The selfish pride of seeing something more powerful than herself, pleading for her to grant his wish was satisfying in a way she couldn't describe. She relished in the simultaneous envy and wrath that Reya's displayed when she learned what sacred gear her new pawn held. Her greed had caused her to want him, and her peerage gluttony over wanting him to be as powerful as can be had been just as much for her goals as it was for her desire for more of it. The worst of them, the one that had been slowly gaining momentum, was lust. The one that she was particularly susceptible to because of which family she came from. We will get her the medical care she needs. Before she knew it, Issei had turned and pulled her into a tight hug, one hand at the back of her head and the other on her back. Issei was only making her struggle worse. The feel of something so powerful made those lustful thoughts bubble up from the depths. His charisma, the magnetism given to him from being the Red Dragon Emperor, only multiplied it. Thank you. He said with a bright and relieved smile after he pulled back. Sona fought down the urge of what Reya's had described to her several weeks ago. For the few seconds that they maintained eye contact, Sona wanted to get him out of that armor and out of his clothes. At the same time, she wanted to do the same thing herself. Luckily her own family trait didn't work as well on her as it did on others. The urge to kiss him, though, that one she didn't think was because of some supernatural phenomenon. Before she stood up, Sona almost thought that she saw Issei slowly moving his face towards hers. Good, at least she wasn't the only one struggling to contain herself. As hard as it was going to be, she needed to follow the standard she had set for herself. Nothing could happen between them before he beat her in chess. As she stood though, her hand had slid from his shoulder to his cheek. But maybe a kiss would be no. Not yet. Her eyes shifted from his lips, back to his eyes. I'll see you tonight. There was one thing she would do. And that was to remove any barriers between them while they slept. If Issei asked, she would say that the increased contact, as small of an increase as it would be, was to help promote better healing. It was a weak justification for wanting to satisfy the need she felt. He had obtained his balance breaker, and she knew that it would leave him more drained than before. Tiamat was not likely to keep the same level of training now that he had it. Sona would not put a label on whatever it was that she felt for her pawn. That would only make things more difficult. It was already getting bad enough that she was considering losing a match intentionally. The thought had only crossed her mind twice, but still. Hopefully giving in to that desire to have them sleep naked would slow down any other urges. Sona walked out of the tent while shaking her head. She knew that wasn't going to happen, but what else could she do? If anything physical happened between them, her mother would just call her a slut and pull back any support from the plan Sona had. And what if Issei never managed to beat her? He'd come close before, but then he'd started to fall asleep. Rational thought did not mesh well with desire. When the personification of that desire kept proving themselves worthy in more ways, it became near impossible to hold back. Just a little while longer. End of the part 10. So how was this story? I hope you like it. And if you like it, share this story with your friends and like the video too. And don't forget to subscribe our channel for daily awesome fanfiction. Okay, it's time for me to go. Bye bye.